Good morning. Having, of course, come off the festive season of Advent and of the holy tide of Christmas, as we have now arrived here in this new year, the year of our Lord 2025, we will be returning naturally to our expository series on the book of Deuteronomy, of course, which we paused in order to focus on the season of Advent itself. But here today we actually have this odd week in our church calendar, in our schedule. And so to fill it, what our purpose will be here today is actually to focus on a topical sermon. Okay, so a sermon in isolation to simply bridge the gap before then. In the coming weeks, we will, as I said, return back to our series on the book of Deuteronomy, picking up actually where we left off about halfway through, roughly speaking, in chapter 10 of the book of Deuteronomy. In order to do so, this topical sermon that we're wanting to explore today actually comes from that passage which had just been read for us, namely from Exodus chapter 22, verses 25 to 27. We'll read that, of course, again just in a moment, but as you might be intrigued to understand what the nature of today's topical sermon, its isolationist sermon, is going to be upon, and more importantly, why. What we have, of course, just experienced at this time of the year, naturally each year, is that of Christmas, and much that goes with that is, of course, something of an epidemic, as one might say, a financial and a fiscal one. So many of us as Australians go into great debt, unfortunately, in this time, to the tune of billions of dollars that is ultimately spent around this time of Christmas and New Year in gifts and presents and holidays and vacations and various other sorts of expenditures. There is a massive amount of wealth and money and financial resources that are spent during this particular time, which naturally, unfortunately, only increase the household debt, usually, of the average Australian, the median household debt in this country. As a result of that, of course, the entire financial system and the banking system as we know it is in great flow and influx during this particular time. It's why, of course, for someone like me, growing up in a family business of hospitality and restauranting, we know full well in my family that you get very busy around Christmas time, and then all of a sudden it gets very quiet by the time you get to February, when people's bills come in from Christmas and New Year's and they realise just how much they actually happened to spend during that period, usually, of course, much more than they perhaps budgeted or scheduled for, if they indeed actually budgeted at all. The amount of money that turns over during this time of year is staggering. Not only in our context, but in the context of the Western world at large. And it brings with it, of course, naturally, by virtue of how much of that money is put down on credit cards, another feature, and that is, of course, namely that of interest. The interest payments alone that are accrued during this time, statistically speaking, of Christmas and of New Year's, are also quite staggering. And in fact, many people, even statistically speaking, a sizable minority of the country, is not able to actually pay off that debt from the interest that is accrued, even in a 12-month period following the previous, what would then be the previous Christmas period. This interest charging is something which, of course, can be so financially crippling for many. Now, granted, of course, it does often come on the backs of, let's just say, high levels of spending that can be either wise or unwise, depending on circumstance. But nevertheless, this notion of finance, which has become such a central feature of Christmas time, is, of course, unfortunate. And it's more than just unfortunate, really, it is, in every meaningful essence of the word, tragic. And so it's perhaps appropriate, again, for the topic or the subject of interest, or in this case, what it is historically known as, usury, to be something that might be valuable for us to actually touch upon. Here, especially as we highlighted in the introduction, is a standalone sermon for this particular transitional period coming out of Christmas into our return ultimately to the book of Deuteronomy. The subject of usury, or of interest, and I'll explain what those terms mean just in a moment's time, is something which I highly doubt. In fact, I would be quite shocked, frankly, if any of you have actually ever heard a sermon on the subject. Certainly, at least I know personally, in my own experience, that I never have in person heard a sermon on this particular subject, even though it is actually something that comes up a multitude of times throughout the scriptures, particularly, of course, the Old Testament in regards to civic laws and other such aspects of the Mosaic Code. But nevertheless, this almost entire absence of Christian discourse and discussion on this subject of interest/usury is something that I would argue in the strongest possible terms is actually to our detriment. It is something that hurts us rather than aids us, especially during the kind of economic regime in which we happen to live, the kind of time economically and politically, the various structures and institutions that are foremost in our society, in our civilization, in the modern era, wherein, of course, as I'm sure many of you well understand, our economy is built at its most foundational level upon the very essence of fiat-based interest lending. This is, of course, the very backbone of the fractional reserve banking system that is ubiquitous, of course, across not only Australia but the Western world, and indeed actually the majority of the world now at large. It has become the global financial system as we so know it in those terms. And the practice, the institution, as it's now essentially become of, as we euphemize it in the modern day, interest, is, as I said, foundational to that. It is at the very heart and the core of our entire financial and economic system. This practice, and you've heard me use a word already twice now, is known historically as usury. Okay? That is the term, in English at least, by which we know that historically. As with many vices and sins, we tend to euphemize and downgrade and water down and all the various other terms you could use there, these things. We, of course, take the murder of innocent children in the womb, right, via abortion, and we call it reproductive rights or women's health care. Okay? We take the abomination of sodomy and refer to it as a nice, clean, very clinical, scientific term of homosexuality. And then we argue, of course, that we can somehow change the primordial covenant of marriage as so instituted by God and bend it and reshape it and recraft it in the image of our own arbitrary will and sinful desire. In such cases as those, we do the very same thing with this practice of usury. Again, we water it down and we euphemize it. We give it a very technical, institutional kind of name of interest. The question, of course, is in whose interest is the custom or is the practice, the institution of interest? In whose interest is it that such a system exists, wherein someone, in this case, of course, we're talking about banks predominantly, lend money to a person. There is a loan of finances, of monies, in which, of course, then an additional percentage is demanded on top of that in return, particularly and especially for payments that are overdue by whatever particular classification is relevant in that context. This charging of interest, as indeed the great depth, the almost unfathomable abyss of modern household debt as it now stands, let alone national debt, of course, across the West, is very much in the interest of these banking institutions, of these financial cartels. It is not, of course, in the interest of the working class. It is not in the interest even of the middle class, especially, who so much of these financial institutions and decisions and policies actually affect most predominantly and who are eroded most ardently by these decisions. It is in the interest of those who control these financial institutions, which, like great leviathans that they are, permeate and infiltrate every square inch of our lives, even all the way down to that of our daily lives. This is the most serious of natures by virtue of the fact that throughout the scriptures, from the very beginning through to the very end, there is one singular position. There is a unified teaching, as we would say, a unified principle on this subject of usury. And you'll hear me refer to it, of course, in this historically accurate or more appropriate term of usury from here on out. And that is one of condemnation. In fact, very explicit condemnation. Very open, very transparent, very blunt condemnation. That usury, the practice of charging interest, to the one who has taken out the loan for whatever particular various reasons of any kind, is itself sinful. And it is sinful by virtue ultimately of how the scriptures connect this as a violation of the commandment against theft. That the charging of interest, the engagement of usury, or engaging in usury rather, is by definition, biblically speaking, theft. Now, of course, we see many times over admonitions and warnings and commandments against, negative commandments in this case, against the practice of usury. And the very text that we had read to us from Exodus chapter 22, verses 25 to 27, is one of those foundational texts. For our time here, we're going to want to start there in Exodus chapter 22, and we're going to then want to move forward, introducing other cross-references, other referential texts, namely and specifically from Ezekiel chapter 18, as well as two more smaller references, as it were, from Proverbs chapter 19 and 1 John chapter 3. But nevertheless, in order to do this, we're going to flow through, as we, of course, often do. And our primary objective will be to gain at least a foundational understanding, an understanding of first principles, as we would say, regarding usury and why it is indeed sinful in the eyes of God. And so, to do that, let's begin in verse 25 of Exodus chapter 22. In this case here, quotation, God speaking to Moses. If you lend money to my people, to the afflicted among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. I'll come back to that in a moment. If you ever take your neighbour's cloak as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun sets, for that is his only covering. It is his only cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall be that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. End quote. So, one of the many times, of course, in which God is demonstrating his love, his affection, his mercy and his graciousness toward the downtrodden, toward the afflicted, toward the oppressed, toward those who are in one form or another, to one degree or another, destitute, down on their luck, as we might say in the modern English idiom. And it is focused here in this particular text before us in Exodus chapter 22 upon a certain aspect, and that is the notion of charity. Much of what we're going to see as we go through these texts, especially as we relate it to this concept of usury, is this other notion, of course, of charity. He says again in verse 25, if you lend money to my people, so there's a very similar parallel to the kind of context in which I was referring to back in the introduction. If you lend money, so the giving of financial aid or financial assistance of various different kinds, a loan, as we would say. If you lend money to my people, to the afflicted among you, so there is a dynamic that exists between, in this case, the lender and the lendee, the one who is giving the money and the one who is then in debt to that person by extension, To the afflicted among you, those who are destitute, those who need a loan, because of course, if one is financially secure and has plenty of wealth or funds available, they are, at least in a basic sense, not in need, emphasis on the word need, of a loan. Now today, just to pause here for one very brief moment, of course in our modern economic system that is entirely built on credit and on debt, where indeed actually you can utilise debt to make incredible amounts of money, especially when structured properly for the end purpose or the goal of maximising cash flow in and through those various debt avenues. That serves in a kind of different context, right? You have gigantic multi-million dollar, indeed even multi-billion dollar companies who will routinely take out massive loans to the tune of 7 or even 8 figures that are quite secure, and of course with investors and stakeholders and shareholders and all such various economic and commercial aspects. You find that very wealthy people actually are quite often, in a technical sense, in debt, but they're using debt for quite considerable financial gain based on the way that, again, our current economic system is built on credit, on fiat currency, which itself is a kind of debt, although we pretend it's not. Nevertheless, that's a more complex economic subject. Through interest-based loaning, right? Also, fiat-based interest loaning, etc., etc. Okay. Historically speaking, you must understand that for the other 99.9% of human history, you took a loan because you were, in one form or another, in dire straits. Okay, there was an element of destitution, again, to one degree or another. You were in need of financial assistance, sometimes even significant financial assistance. And so this kind of phraseology, this kind of terminology of "to the afflicted among you" is totally natural, not only in the context in which it finds itself, but really actually throughout the preponderance of human history. And of course that is still the case today. Right now, people take out mortgages because they quite literally cannot afford to actually buy a house outright. Now, that is a consequence of the very same financial corruption that we are also referring to here in regards to usury and interest and fiat currencies and other such things, but that's a different subject. In this case, here and now, the afflicted among you, the poor, those who are in need of financial assistance, that's the very obvious, basic, kind of common historical example of someone who would be taking a loan. Okay? So to such afflicted people, he continues, verse 25, you are not to act as a creditor to him. You shall not charge him interest. Okay? The practice of what is historically in English known as usury. Okay? Of course, I highly doubt that I need to explain interest, but even just for the sake of the thought experiment, in the most rudimentary and simple terms, someone needs $100. I agree to lend them $100, but I demand that they give me 10% in interest. Okay? So I give them $100, but demand back ultimately $110. All right? This is, again, an extremely rudimentary example of interest. Okay, there are other added levels of complexity to that, of course, especially when you're talking about entire global economic systems. But nevertheless, this practice of charging interest, again, of engaging in usury, is already, just even in verse 25, expressly outlawed. Okay? You shall not charge him interest. Okay? Now, there's an important point to make as we bridge between verse 25 and then verses 26 and 27. Okay? It's important for you to understand, as we then move into these next two verses, what often goes on in these kinds of scenarios, especially as we approach it in the modern day. Okay? This particular text that we have before us, Exodus chapter 22, verses 25 to 27, among others, is one such text wherein all manner of mental gymnastics are performed in order to somehow justify and rationalize the sin of usury. Okay? In order to justify it, not only from a biblical perspective, but even just from a broader ethical perspective, as it applies or as it relates to modern day economic practices, both institutionally and, of course, otherwise. Right? I'll highlight those as we go through because I want you to see the fact that they are indeed just that, mental gymnastics. Okay? They are post hoc rationalizations, as we might say. They are eisegetical in nature, as opposed to exegetical, so that is to say, it's reading desired outcomes and meanings into the text, not approaching the text objectively and drawing meaning out of it. Right? And by highlighting these, I want you to then hopefully be able to see what the core fundamental essence is, which is, as I just stated earlier, the very clear illegality, the very clear outlawing of usury, of the charging of interest. That when God says you shall not charge him interest, what he actually means is you shall not charge him interest. Okay? That there's no hidden meaning to this text. There's no veiled and obscure definitions that we need to somehow figure out. There's no esoteric understanding that completely changes the very meaning of the text from top to bottom. No. You shall not charge him interest. This is a fundamental moral and ethical command, born ultimately, of course, off of the command against theft. Right? You shall not steal. Right? You shall not engage in theft. You shall not be a thief. Right? Because inherently what is going on, even in that very simple, rudimentary example I used earlier of lending $100 but demanding $110 back, okay, there is this window of that 10%, that $10 in this particular example, that serves as the line between genuine charity and sin, okay, the sin of usury. There are two layers to it that we're going to see as we now move on to these verses. There is that of the actual element of theft, okay, the literal, tangible act of stealing money that you had no right to, okay? So taking that which is not rightfully yours, which is what the essence of theft is. And then there is the deeper level, right, with regards to the nature of and the virtue and the value of charity itself, okay? So there's the pragmatic, there's the material aspect, and then there's the deeper heart of the issue, the spiritual matter, as we might otherwise say, okay? So there's two levels to it, which is, of course, very strongly in keeping with the nature of the law. There's the pragmatic, right, the material element, and then there is the deeper spiritual essence of the law. Of course, we know quite well that Christ speaks to that most famously in the Sermon on the Mount. Right? You have heard it said, da-da-da-da-da, but I say to you, da-da-da-da-da. Okay? The letter of the law and the spirit of the law, as we often phrase it so aptly in the English language. Okay? We'll be seeing that actually unfold for us right here before our eyes in this passage of verses 25 to 27 of Exodus 22. Okay? So you've got the letter of the law already. You've got, you shall not charge him interest. And then we get an unpacking of that and an envelopment of that with the spirit of the law, as we would say. Okay? So verse 26. If you ever take your neighbour's cloak as a pledge, right, so a surety or an assurance, the payment will be restored from that loan. If you ever take your neighbour's cloak as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun sets. Okay. Why? Well, for that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. Again, keeping in mind, of course, he's destitute, right? He is the afflicted among you, back into verse 25. What else shall he sleep in? Right? Are you seriously going to take the clothes off his own back? Right? That's the implication there. Okay. Now, the shrewd financial mind might go, well, but hold on, you took the cloak as an assurance of repayment for that debt, right? For that loan that was given, that was mentioned in the prior verse. What if he hasn't paid it back yet? Why are you giving back the assurance, the surety, right? That which is essentially a hedge against the debt, right, financially speaking, if he hasn't yet repaid the debt? Well, of course, it is that deeper level, as I mentioned just earlier, of the spirit of the law. It is the essence of the virtue of charity. Okay? If money is being lent, if money is being given, the inherent implication is that it is meant to be done not just merely in some legal sense, but on a deeper moral and ethical level, from a position and a heart of charity. Okay? The giving of financial alms and even of loaning money, okay, because there is a difference, right, in many respects between giving charitable alms, as we say, ALMS, right, alms, okay, financial charitable donations, as we might call them, right, in today's era, and a financial loan, okay. It is okay to give a loan with the expectation that the debt will be repaid over X amount of time, right? It might be a fixed term, it might be indefinite. Of course, that will obviously depend between whether it's a formal institutional loan or if it's a private loan between friends or between family members, whatever, right? There's going to be different contexts, of course. But in this particular case, whichever it is, the point is that anything, be it almsgiving or financial loans, are all meant to be conducted in the spirit of charity, okay? Which is exactly why he finishes verse 27, just before we come back to one of the main points there, by saying, "And it shall be that when he cries out to me," right, when he's destitute and he prays to me and he calls upon my aid, says God, "I will hear him, for I am gracious." Now, I want to ensure that we don't just gloss over that reference, okay? Because it's actually central to understanding the point that God's making herein, right? The word charity, as we have it in English, comes from the Greek charis, okay? You can think of it like charis, 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 which is where we get that word charity, as I mentioned. But charis is the Greek word that we have all throughout the Bible, and in fact you actually have it right here in front of you, okay, in the Greek version of the book of Exodus, in the Greek version of the Old Testament. And that is, of course, charis, meaning grace. That is the essence of what that particular word means. Charis is the standard Greek word that we have for grace. So all the times that you see the term grace discussed in the scriptures, of course, which is, all over the place, understand that it is the word charity, ultimately, okay? And charity is, of course, having its own semantic flavour, as we might say. There is a particular semantic meaning to it. But nevertheless, there is a deep, historic, fundamental connection, etymologically, as well as semantically, so in other words, the construct of the word and the meaning of the word, between charity and grace. Do we understand? Yeah? Grace, charity, charis. Okay? So to be gracious is to be charitable, right? It's to give something that is otherwise undeserved. Okay? It is an extension, of course, of love, although that's a deeper subject, right, for another lesson. But in this particular case, "I will hear him," says the Lord, "for I am gracious." We can equally and rightfully say, especially in English, that can be read, at least at the conceptual level, as "I will hear him, for I am charitable." Okay? That's a perfectly appropriate understanding of what is meant here semantically. Right? So it's not just merely some vague abstract connection that I'm drawing. There's actually a direct literary link between charity and the lending or loaning of money, okay, of financial aid in that particular case. Again, especially as it relates to becoming a creditor and the charging of interest, i.e. the engagement of usury. Right? So then circling back to that earlier point to finish it off, of that question that was asked, well, why are you taking back the assurance, right, the cloak that was held, right, if he hasn't paid it back yet? Well, because the very heart and essence of charity is what is first and foremost required. You should not be lending, i.e. loaning money of whatever kind to people in order to financially benefit, to profit especially, okay? It should be done, if it is done, from a heart and a disposition of graciousness, i.e. charity. Okay? That is the sound, virtuous ethic of loaning or lending of money. Okay? Because God himself is gracious. So the man may not have repaid the debt in full or even in part, but he needs his cloak. So you don't take his cloak from him. Okay? Now again, words like these and verses like these are wholesale ignored. Utterly and entirely ignored in our modern economic regime, in our modern financial system. Okay? These concepts of graciousness are nowhere, utterly nowhere to be found, right, in any meaningful capacity, especially and particularly at the institutional level. It is not just merely treated as business, it is treated as an exorbitantly for-profit business. This is fundamentally and inherently what the banks have become. They were not this historically. Okay? Modern banking, as we know it, at least in a comparable sense, really stretches back about 1,000 years, especially to the financial institution established by even medieval organisations like the Knights Templar. Okay? The Crusader Order of the Knights Templar, who established a kind of banking system, is really the bedrock and the foundation of modern banking as we know it. Okay? And that's a whole other discussion. I'd be happy to explain that to you if you're interested over morning tea. But nevertheless, this system in which we currently live is a business, and a business that desires to absolutely maximise profits at the expense of all else. Okay? The doctrine of shareholder capitalism, as we know it and understand it, of the primary obligation of any business, including the banks, is to maximise profits for its shareholders, is a concept, very modern one, only about 100 years old, that utterly decimates the notion of charity as it relates to the lending or the loaning of monies or finance in general. Okay. And that's why, again, the kind of post hoc rationalizations, the excuses that are levied even by Christians, unfortunately, in this kind of texts, are related to the very words which speak against it. So, for example, to give you one of those, common argument that gets made as to limit the scope in which this is talking about, by this I mean you shall not charge him interest, right? To narrow the scope of application to a very specific, limited set of circumstances, to give a kind of, as I said, rationalisation and an excuse for other areas where we can charge interest, right, is tied to things like the lending of the cloak, for example. To the afflicted among you, oh well, it's only if you're lending to someone who's poor that you should not charge interest. Okay? And if it's someone wealthy though, or if it's someone who's well-to-do, then charging interest is totally fine. Okay? That's a common argument. In fact, I've heard that argument made many, many times, including, unfortunately, by Christians. The problem is, well, there's two large problems. The first is a literary one, the other is a historical one. The first problem is that literarily, what possible biblical definition do we have for objectively determining who is wealthy enough to be allowed interest to be charged against them? Do we draw it based on absolute poverty? Do we draw it based on relative poverty? What if someone's barely keeping their head above the relative poverty line, which is actually what a lot of people are in the position of now, right? Of barely keeping their head afloat above the relative poverty line. So they're above that relative poverty line, but by how much? How much do they have to be distant from that relative poverty line before we think it's acceptable to charge them interest? Is it a dollar value? Is it a percentage value? Do we base it on average income or median income? Individual income or household income? Do we balance it with consumer price indexes? Do we balance it as a ratio to GDP? How do we measure these things? Again, this is the problem when you come up with excuses and rationalizations all of a sudden you find yourself doing Olympic level mental gymnastics, coming up with all kinds of arbitrary, completely arbitrary definitions and distinctions, that you could get 100 people in a room and you get 100 different answers as to what that might actually be. Instead of just taking God at his word. Instead of reading very clear, succinct words like, you shall not charge him interest. Instead, be charitable and gracious, which is ultimately what verse 27 finishes by explaining. Okay? That's the literary point. The other point, as I mentioned earlier, is the historical one. The problem with the modern rationalizations that occur in order to euphemize and to keep it at bay, the sin of usury, is the fact that, historically speaking, Christians never believed this. By this I mean that interest is actually allowable, that you're able to engage in the charging of interest, right? Usury. In fact, the church condemned usury all the way throughout the early church. It condemned it ardently throughout the medieval period. In fact, there are a number of very major condemnations coming out of the highest levels of Christendom against the practice of usury. There were people who were exiled from kingdoms for charging interest and engaging in usury. In fact, a number of expulsions of people throughout the Middle Ages for the charging of interest engaging in usury against the people, right? Including noblemen. So it's not just the poor and the destitute, but also the nobility were being charged interest by various different kinds of groups, some more than others, of course, quite commonly throughout history. But in this particular case, the church was of a universal, ubiquitous understanding and position. Engaging in usury is illegal. It is unlawful. It is immoral. It is sinful. Okay? Now, of course, you can point to historical examples where that was ignored, or where rules were bent, or where things were swept under the rug, elements of corruption, of course. But I'm talking about the principle level. I'm talking about the fundamental principles. Okay? Usury is a sin. It is an abuse of charity, and it treats the individual as an object from which you can extract profit, right? Profit. Okay? And by doing so, you naturally and automatically engage in another great sin, that of theft. You steal. To use once more that example from earlier in our time this morning, that of the $100 that one lends out and demands 10% off the top, so $110 back. The essence of that theft is the fact that you have no moral authority. That is to say, you have no moral right to that $10. You've given $100. You do have a moral right to restore the $100. Again, there is the avenue for legitimate lending of money that is not just merely almsgiving, right? Which is where you give the $100 with zero expectation of return. Okay, you find both categories in Scripture. Okay, talked about quite often, in fact. The lending, the loaning, is a legitimate category. However, you only gave $100. You had moral right, moral authority over that 100 when you gave it, hence why you were able to give it. It was yours to give away. If there is an understanding of restitution of that $100, right, repaying the debt, as we might say, you only have a moral right to, at most, $100. Even then, if this were a different sermon on charity specifically, you shouldn't even necessarily demand the $100. There might be a scenario in which the individual is only able to pay back $80, okay, due to a whole host of various different, specifics regarding their financial state, other things, family life, employment opportunities, whatever happens to be, right? And you should still give with a charitable, i.e. gracious heart. That's a whole other lesson, right? But nevertheless, the maximum that you have the moral right to demand in return is 100. It is whatever the equivalent is of the money that you gave in the first place. That's the maximum. to go over that, to encroach upon that, right? To go past that $100 is by definition to take something that the other person had the moral right to, not yourself. It is, in the most foundational sense, a textbook example of theft. No ifs, no buts, no grand debates, no rationalizations, no excuses, no euphemisms. It's theft. It's always been theft. It always will be theft. Right? It's why we get this kind of language that we see elsewhere in the scriptures. Again, even to just give you one brief example, Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 7 to 9. If a man does not mistreat anyone, but returns to the debtor his pledge, does not commit robbery, but rather gives his bread to the hungry and covers the naked with clothing. In other words, doesn't engage in the theft, but rather is charitable, gracious, right? We're seeing this dynamic play out again. If he does not lend money at interest or take increase, right? In other words, he's using those terms synonymously. To take increase is exactly that dynamic I was just talking about, right? You give 100 but demand 110, that's the taking increase, right? From 100 to 110, okay, right? If he does not lend money at interest nor take increase, if he turns his hand from injustice and does true justice between man and man, if he walks in my statutes and my judgments and is careful to do the truth, he is righteous and he will surely live, declares the Lord. Now, this particular part of Ezekiel is coming in the confluence of a whole host of other kinds of sins, but one such sin that is being mentioned is what we have right there in verse 8. Right? In this case, talking about turning away from the sin is the context. If he does not lend money at interest nor take increase, if he turns his hand from injustice and does true justice between man and man. Do you see what the Lord is saying there? Right? Have you observed? Can you hear what the point is in that particular text? The charging of interest, the lending of money at interest and taking increase is, as God just defined it, an injustice. It is an injustice. It is evil. It is sinful. Hence why we should turn toward engaging in true justice between man and man. Right? Again, this is just one of the many other repeated examples throughout Scripture in which the charging of interest, engaging in usury, is sinful, in which it is highlighted very clearly and very specifically, and very obviously, might I say, as a moral vice, as an evil. It's so vitally important for us to understand this, right? It is an abuse of what should otherwise be graciousness and charitability. It is an abuse of the spirit of God's heart for those who are in need, to whatever particular degree. Again, there is no line that we draw there, right? Outside of purely subjective, arbitrary definitions and distinctions. God's care for those who are less fortunate than us, for those who are poor, for those who are destitute, for those who are in need. Again, all these terms I'm using synonymously here. His heart for those as our great and divine Father is what we ourselves should be reflecting. And it's what any Christian nation ever worthy of bearing the name should have at the very foundation of all things, but including and particularly its financial institutions, its economy at large. This is the very essence of the point. For indeed, as he says also in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17, especially as it relates back to what we looked at in Exodus 22, quote, "He who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his bountiful deed." To give to those who are in need, to lend in this case is a specific word that's used, right? To lend to the poor man is indeed ultimately a gracious act of lending to the Lord. To care for those in need reflects the heart of our gracious and ever benevolent Father. It is to walk in conformity with the divine will. It is to reflect truly the imago Dei, the image of God. He who is gracious to a poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his bountiful deed. This is why, again, even the apostles, such as St. John, in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16 to 18, by this we have known love, that he laid down his life for us, in reference to Christ, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, do not let love with word, let us not love with word or with tongue, but rather in deed and in truth. Yeah? Do not merely say that we are loving, but rather do love, perform love, right? Be loving not merely in word, but also, most importantly, in deed. It is a great plight upon our people. It is a most pernicious and wicked sin, this great sin of usury, which is so foundational to our entire economic system that indeed we have ultimately in the long term, and I am speaking long term here, no choice but to end its practice. God will not shine favourably upon us from an economic perspective or an economic standpoint, whilst ever we continue to engage in this great moral evil. Now, do be sure, again, the person against whom the interest is charged, the one who is the victim of the usury, is just that, the victim. Okay, there is no moral guilt, as it were, on the part of the party against whom the interest was charged. No, you are the victim of that. Okay? And if you have ever been charged interest, you are the victim of that sin. Okay? I'm speaking on the bigger level, the institutional level. Now again, you may think, well, how does this apply to me? Of course, there is the individual element. Any one of you as Christians, you have no business ever, under any circumstances, lending money and demanding interest. Okay? Lend money, engage in almsgiving or financial loans or lending in the private context, that's totally fine in either direction. But you must never, ever charge interest. It is a great moral evil, and you will be violating the commandment against theft. There is no debate about that. Again, to repeat an earlier point, the church universally understood this for thousands upon thousands of years. Okay? But on that larger level, which of course far surpasses our own individual reach, we must understand that such seemingly massive institutional changes, societal level changes, come when, among other factors, the people, shift in their understanding and their application of how these things should be operating. Again, our own children and our children's children are but the leaders of these various institutions and aspects of both economic and cultural and political life of the future. It is they who will be making these decisions. It is they who will be deciding whether to upkeep this great moral evil and this inherent ethical corruption, or whether they will seek to reform or even rebuild in a more righteous, virtuous, and biblical manner. So no matter what level we look at, from the individual all the way up to not even merely the national, but the global these days, we each actually do have a part to play in transmitting the rightful understanding of how these things should operate, okay? The great Christian virtues and ethics and morals that once built our unparalleled civilization, that built Christendom into the greatest civilization that the world has ever known. We flourished greatly from strength to striding strength when we obeyed God. We now currently suffer under the unfathomable and almost immeasurable weight of the tyranny of our current financial and economic system, because we have departed from this, because robber barons have taken over these institutions, and because we have become subjected to oppression beyond any historical comparison when it comes to things like finances and economics at large. It is the judgment of God against us, quite frankly, okay, as these things all too often are. This is the judgment of God. If we want to be greedy, if we want to be selfish, if we want to increase financial gain and profit at all costs, then God will indeed raise up pernicious and wicked men to guide and to lead and to build these systems in that direction. And we suffer for it. And so, like with everything else, again, there must be repentance. There must be a rightful understanding of the great moral evil of, in this particular case that we've been looking at here this morning, usury. Understand that it is a sin. Understand why it is a sin. Understand how we must then, again, reshape our understanding and return back to a more biblical and righteous position concerning how we engage in charity and how we engage in this specific case, things like financial lending and loaning of money. Okay. Now, to repeat a final point that was brought in all the way back at the introduction, the fact that you have never heard, in all probability, a sermon on usury. You now have, so congratulations. But in this particular case, understand that such problems thrive in many respects, largely because we never talk about it. We ignore these things. We sweep them under the rug. We may acknowledge them in passing every now and then when pressed to, but for the other 99.9 repeated percent of time, we just simply ignore it. And we just carry on business as usual while our neighbours suffer, while we suffer, while great and immeasurable abuses and tyranny abounds because we remain silent. The silence, friends, is as much of a sin as the usury is itself. For there is arguably no greater sin than silence in the face of evil. Its acquiescence thereunto is in itself a great wickedness. And so we must turn away from that kind of silence. We must, hopefully, have more scenarios where such seemingly niche subjects, I say that in inverted commas, of course, are no longer confined to the realm of the niche, are no longer put in the back of the shelf, down in the basement, in the dark. But instead, we actually address these things with the seriousness that they warrant and the great weightiness that they so inherently deserve. We must be charitable and gracious at all levels with regards to almsgiving and financial loaning and lending, from the individual all the way up, indeed to the national and the global. For indeed, as God so himself says, he is gracious. And the one who is gracious, therefore, to the poor man lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his bountiful deed. Amen.